The order did not come from a distant palace office or an anonymous committee. It came directly from Princess Anne. With one signature, she revoked Prince Harry's remaining rights at Gatcombe Park and assigned the property's future to Lady Louise Windsor. For Harry, it was not merely the loss of an estate. It was the destruction of one of his final private connections to the royal family he had left behind. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. And stood over the transferred document in silence, but there was no triumph. Gatcombe Park was more than her Gloucestershire estate. It was the home she had protected as a place of family continuity, service, and trust. Harry had retained limited use of a secluded residence there whenever he returned to Britain under agreed conditions. That private family arrangement meant he possessed refuge inside the royal world. Now that refuge was gone. The Princess Royal terminated his access, deleted his name from the estate arrangement, and granted its future rights to Louise. The title Princess Royal is the honour given to the monarch's eldest daughter. But here, it also reflected Anne's authority over the home she had guarded for decades. She placed the document on the table, read Harry's name one final time, and drew a firm line through it. Her pen then moved beside Louise's name. Her hand paused, and remembered the frightened boy who had once escaped to Gatcombe when royal life became unbearable. She remembered his anger, grief, and rare trust in her blunt honesty. Yet memory could not erase the breach involving the estate, an act she regarded as an attack on family confidence rather than simple disloyalty. After his departure from royal duty, Harry received the decision through a sealed communication, a private letter delivered under security instead of a public announcement. At first, he believed an official had made a mistake. Then, he reached the final page and saw his aunt's signature. Disbelief hardened into fury. He demanded a private meeting with and insisted that no advisor stand between them. Louise still knew nothing, and had withheld the decision from her niece until every signature was complete, fearing compassion might interrupt what she believed necessary. Yet, the new beneficiary would soon discover that she had inherited more than access. She had inherited a place in a family conflict close to breaking. But before Harry could confront the woman who had erased his place at Gatcombe, he had to face the painful truth that Lady Louise now represented everything and believed he had abandoned to understand why and chose Louise over Harry. One must understand what each of them had come to represent in her eyes. Harry was the nephew she had once defended when the institution seemed determined to shape him into someone he could never become. Louise was the quiet young woman who asked for no privilege, sought no recognition, and carried the weight of royal expectation without turning her discomfort into public conflict, and had recognized Harry's restlessness long before it evolved into open rebellion. When other relatives treated his anger as a public relations issue, she spoke to him directly and refused to hide difficult truths behind polished palace language. The institution meant the wider royal system of advisors, duties, and family expectations surrounding the crown, and she understood how easily that system could make a wounded young man feel managed instead of understood. He trusted her because she never pretended his pain was uncomplicated. Harry once arrived at Gatcombe after a royal engagement that had left him shaken and frustrated. He sat across from his aunt in the private study, still carrying the disappointment of the day while she listened without interruption. Then leaned forward and told him that family refuge survived only when family trust survived. He remembered those words because they sounded less like a warning and more like a promise. Years later, they would return with devastating force. Louise earned Anne's confidence in a completely different way. After an exhausting equestrian event, the younger woman quietly removed her gloves, poured tea, and asked whether her aunt needed assistance. She never mentioned inheritance, status, or future privilege. Her quiet nature, shared love of horses, and instinct to protect private family moments made her dependable. The Princess Royal, the title traditionally given to the sovereign's eldest daughter, saw in her niece someone who understood that service often happened without recognition. Harry could not accept the decision so calmly. He felt replaced by a cousin who had never experienced his level of scrutiny, grief, exile, or public criticism. Louise, however, felt no sense of victory when Edward informed her about the revised estate arrangement. She looked at her father in disbelief and immediately asked whether Harry had already been told. The Duke of Edinburgh, a senior royal title held by her father, warned that accepting Gatcombe's future might permanently alter how her cousin viewed her, and had not chosen rank over blood. She had chosen responsibility over disorder. She wanted the estate protected by someone who would preserve its privacy rather than turn access into influence. Yet Louise's unease deepened when Edward revealed that the transfer had followed one private gathering at Gatcombe, where Harry had made a promise no one expected him to break. Hidden behind an signature was one evening that transformed Harry from a wounded relative seeking shelter into a man she believed could no longer be trusted with it. The collapse of Harry's place at Gatcombe began months earlier during a private family dinner that was never intended to leave the estate walls. There were no cameras, no official records, and no palace advisors directing the discussion, and had offered him a rare opportunity to speak openly. By the following morning, details known only to those seated around her table had reached people who were never supposed to hear them, and had invited Harry to Gatcombe because she still believed a narrow path back into family life might exist. It would not restore his former royal role, meaning the official duties and public responsibilities he had once carried on behalf of the crown, but it could give him private contact without reopening every old conflict. Louise and Edward joined part of the dinner because their aunt wanted him to reconnect with relatives beyond the tension surrounding Charles and William. For one evening, she hoped the family might speak without strategy. Harry listened as the conversation softened, but the true purpose emerged when Anne placed an unsigned proposal on the table. She revealed a confidential plan to establish a family equestrian trust at Gatcombe Park and place Louise in charge of it. The trust was a private legal arrangement designed to protect land, funds, and responsibilities for a specific purpose. For the younger woman, it represented duty without spectacle. For her cousin, it looked like another sign that the monarchy was shaping its future around people who had never walked away. Louise said very little, yet her discomfort was obvious. Edward reassured his daughter that nothing had been finalized, while Harry asked whether the proposal was intended to create a new royal circle beyond Charles and William, and dismissed the suggestion immediately. She told him the trust was about horses, service, and continuity, not power. Then Harry looked directly at his aunt and promised that the conversation would remain inside the room. She studied him for a moment before sliding the unsigned proposal across the table. 2 days later, everything changed, and received a documented report of a private media briefing that described her proposal as an attempt to build a rival royal network around Louise. One sentence from her handwritten proposal appeared almost word for word. She folded the page once and remained silent for several minutes. Her anger was restrained, but unquestionable. Louise felt exposed and humiliated, while Edward demanded that his daughter's name be removed from every discussion until the source was identified. Harry denied approving the disclosure during a recorded telephone conversation with his aunt. Yet when she asked who had seen his notes after dinner, he refused to answer, and heard more than caution in that silence. She heard a nephew protecting someone outside the family while those inside had absorbed the consequences. The breach forced Anne to order a complete review of every private Gatcombe access agreement. The estate office then uncovered another request submitted through Harry's connection, one serious enough to remove every remaining hesitation. She summoned him alone and barred lawyers, secretaries, and spouses from the meeting. What began as a broken confidence was about to become a direct reckoning because Anne no longer wanted explanations delivered through other people. She wanted Harry to answer her alone. When Harry entered Anne's private sitting room, he expected an argument about leaked conversations. Instead, he found his access papers arranged beside a second file marked with dates, names, and security requests, and did not offer him tea. She did not ask about California. She pointed toward the chair opposite her and waited until the door closed. Then she delivered the accusation that changed everything. "You used my home without asking me." Harry stopped beside the chair, but his aunt never looked away. No aides waited outside to carry messages. No lawyers sat nearby to reshape his words. Meghan, Charles, and William were absent, and there were no palace officials to soften the moment. This was not a royal consultation, meaning a formal family discussion guided by advisors and protocol. It was a reckoning between two people who had once trusted each other, and opened the second file and revealed that a member of Harry's outside team had contacted the Gatcombe estate office. The request sought permission to arrange a private media meeting during his next planned stay. It described controlled access, selected guests, and a carefully coordinated message. She pushed the document across the table. Harry gripped its edge and read the wording twice, realizing that the secluded residence connected to him could have been used as the setting for a public strategy. Harry insisted he had never approved any media event. He argued that staff often explored possibilities before consulting him and that a request did not prove intention, and rejected that distinction. Anyone acting in his name carried his authority, she said, especially when they approached her home without her knowledge. Gatcombe mattered because it had remained outside the public battles consuming the family. It was also one of the last places where he had been welcomed as a nephew rather than treated as a problem. Harry's frustration finally surfaced. He accused Anne of choosing Louise because the younger woman was obedient, protected, and unlikely to challenge the monarchy, and answered without raising her voice. Louise understood the difference between private pain and public ammunition. Those words struck him harder than shouting ever could. Harry looked down and quietly asked whether his aunt had ever truly believed his denial after the dinner leak. She admitted that she had wanted to believe him. Yet trust could not survive repeated uncertainty, unanswered questions, and outsiders using family access for advantage. And then pulled the removal document from beneath the file. She had prepared it before the meeting but left it unsigned in case Harry accepted responsibility without qualification. He refused to apologize for actions he insisted were not his own. The silence stretched. Then she lifted the pen, signed the order, and calmly informed him that his access to Gatcombe had ended. Harry walked away convinced that and had acted alone. He did not yet realize that the transfer rested on a deeper legal commitment reaching far beyond that room. The signature belonged to Anne, but the authority that made it permanent rested on an older arrangement involving inheritance, private ownership, and a promise made long before Harry stepped away. Harry had spent years fighting the visible machinery of the monarchy, titles, security decisions, palace statements, and constitutional boundaries. Gatcombe Park was different. It was not controlled by a public royal office that could be challenged through public pressure. It belonged to Anne's private world. Within that world, her authority was direct, personal, and almost impossible to overturn. Yet even she had sought one final assurance before removing him permanently. Charles read the proposed transfer alone. He removed his glasses, placed the document on a table, and remained silent because every line carried two painful realities. His son was about to lose another place connected to home. Yet his sister had every right to defend the estate she had protected beyond palace politics. The private occupancy arrangement meant a family agreement allowing Harry limited use of part of Gatcombe without granting him ownership, and could therefore withdraw that access without seeking approval from any public royal office, and entered after the king had finished reading and refused to soften the purpose of the meeting. She told him she was not asking for permission. She was extending the courtesy of informing him before the order became permanent. Charles asked whether Harry might receive one final restricted visit, perhaps under strict conditions, so the removal would not feel like another door closing without warning. His sister replied that a boundary lost all meaning if it was delayed every time someone challenged it. Charles felt the weight of those words. He wanted to protect his son from another painful rejection. But he also knew Gatcombe mattered because it had remained private, dependable, and untouched while the wider family fractured in public, and reminded him of a conversation with the late Queen, preserved in a documented record among her personal estate papers. Their mother had urged her to keep the property rooted in dependable service rather than allow it to become a refuge claimed only during moments of crisis, and then revealed the handwritten clause within her estate planning. Estate planning meant the private legal instructions controlling how property and responsibilities would pass in the future. The clause allowed her to appoint a younger family steward whose conduct reflected continuity. Louise had become the strongest choice because her future rights came with responsibilities. Protecting the estate's privacy, supporting equestrian work, preserving family use, and preventing commercial exploitation. Charles understood that Louise was not receiving a reward. She was accepting a responsibility. He chose not to interfere, but asked his sister to make that clear before the younger woman accepted anything. And agreed. She had never intended the transfer to become a public triumph over Harry. The decision moved forward immediately. Estate staff received instructions to implement the change, and the systems that had recognized Harry for years quietly began to update. The family debate ended in silence. But at Gatcombe itself, the consequences became visible almost immediately, and Harry's removal was about to feel far more personal than any signed document. The first consequence was not announced from Buckingham Palace. It appeared on a secure estate system before sunrise. Harry's arrival permissions disappeared. His private access code was deactivated. The small residence once reserved for his visits was marked for reassignment. By breakfast, the people responsible for Gatcombe's gates had received one simple instruction. Prince Harry was no longer authorized to enter without Anne's direct invitation. The estate manager stared at the approved family list before removing Harry's name. That list was the private record identifying who could enter Gatcombe without separate permission, and his name had been there since childhood. The manager paused for a moment, then confirmed the removal. Staff received instructions to clear the residence, pack personal belongings, preserve family photographs, and prepare the rooms for future use under Louise's stewardship. Stewardship meant responsibility for protecting the property, not simply enjoying it. Harry realized what the order truly meant when a long-serving Gatcombe employee called and asked where several boxes should be delivered. At first, he believed the man had misunderstood. Then he heard the careful tone in his voice and realized the clearing had already begun. He walked away from the phone, returned moments later, and quietly asked whether his aunt had personally ordered every trace of him removed. The reply was calm but unmistakable, and felt no satisfaction. She watched a childhood photograph of Harry being carefully wrapped for delivery, and remembered how freely he had once laughed at Gatcombe. For a brief moment, the decision looked less like protection and more like punishment. Yet the request to arrange a media meeting inside her home returned to her thoughts. She refused to reverse the order because the estate's privacy had become the final boundary she could still defend. Louise arrived unexpectedly and found staff preparing the rooms. She immediately asked them to stop. The younger woman did not want to inherit through her cousin's humiliation, and she refused to let his belongings be treated like the remains of an enemy. When and questioned her hesitation, Louise answered that responsibility should never require cruelty. Her aunt listened carefully, but reminded her that delay had already weakened too many family boundaries. The estate office then discovered a locked drawer. Inside was a handwritten note Harry had once left for and, thanking her for giving him a place where he did not have to perform. She read it alone and felt the full weight of what had been lost. Still, the recent breach remained impossible to overlook. Louise made a decision of her own. Through a private message, she asked Harry to meet without advisors before she formally accepted the arrangement. He agreed, though he did not know whether she was coming as his replacement, his opponent, or the only relative still willing to hear him. For the first time since Anne's order, the conflict moved away from documents and authority, leaving only two cousins and the painful inheritance standing between them. Lady Louise did not meet Harry at a palace, an estate office, or behind a table crowded with legal papers. She selected a modest private room away from Gatcombe, arrived without her parents, and asked him to come without advisors. There was no institutional protection between them. No one could interrupt, reinterpret, or issue a statement afterward. For the first time, Harry faced the person whose future had been secured by his removal. Louise had arranged the meeting against Edward's advice because she refused to accept a family responsibility without hearing her cousin directly. The acceptance page was the document confirming that she agreed to take on the future rights and responsibilities connected to Gatcombe. She placed it unsigned between them and folded her hands, making one fact impossible to ignore. Nothing had been finalized yet. Harry entered cautiously and remained standing for several seconds. He assumed Louise had come to defend Anne, but she began by saying she had never asked for his rooms, his access, or his symbolic place within the family. Her cousin replied that seeing her name replace his felt like proof that the monarchy favoured quiet obedience over difficult honesty. To him, the transfer was not merely about property. It confirmed his fear that the family rewarded those who stayed silent and removed those who challenged it. Louise did not step back. She told Harry that silence was not always surrender. Sometimes it was the discipline of refusing to make private wounds even more painful for everyone else. The words unsettled him because they carried no accusation, only a boundary. He insisted once again that he had never approved the leaked equestrian trust details or the proposed media meeting. Yet, after a long pause, he admitted something he had refused to tell Anne. He had allowed people around him to treat family access as a strategic opportunity. Harry's admission changed the atmosphere. He said he had mistaken control for protection and assumed every possible option needed to be explored before anyone could close another door against him. Louise listened carefully before explaining that Anne had not chosen her because she was more loved. Her aunt had chosen her because Gatcombe required someone willing to protect what happened there, even when doing so brought no recognition. Louise offered to preserve Harry's childhood belongings and keep one private family room containing memories of Diana, and the cousin's early years. His anger softened. He told her not to reject her future, only to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. Only then did Louise sign. Harry watched the pen leave the page and understood that something had ended, but something even worse had been prevented. They did not embrace. They did not pretend the damage had disappeared. Yet when they left, neither regarded the other as an enemy. Harry and Louise left the room without reconciliation, but no longer as enemies. Outside that fragile peace, the country was preparing to turn a family boundary into a national judgment. By the next morning, Anne's private decision had become a national spectacle. Broadcasters spoke of exile, succession, loyalty, and revenge. Commentators treated Gatcombe Park as though it were another royal title being stripped away. Yet the image that came to define the story was painfully simple. Harry's name appeared beneath a photograph of the closed estate gates, while Louise stood beside a headline declaring that a new generation had been chosen. The newspaper's front page carried 4 striking words: "And closes the gate." Harry appeared alone beneath Gatcombe's locked entrance, while Louise was shown attending a quiet equestrian engagement, unaware that the image would be used to suggest victory. An equestrian engagement meant an official or charitable event connected to horses and riding, an area closely associated with its public service. The contrast was deliberate. One cousin looked excluded. The other looked selected. A major morning broadcaster described the order as the clearest private rejection Harry had faced since stepping away from royal duties. That description transformed a family property decision into a national debate about belonging. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered beneath the palace gates. Some held messages supporting Anne's right to protect her home. Others argued that Harry had already lost enough and was being punished beyond reason. Harry watched the coverage with controlled frustration. He heard Louise described as his replacement, but refused to criticize her publicly after their private meeting. When an advisor suggested releasing a strong public response, he declined. For the first time, his pain did not become another weapon against the family member standing closest to the conflict. Louise experienced the pressure differently. Cameras followed her to a university-related engagement, and she paused before entering. She quietly told Edward that she feared being turned into a weapon against her cousin. Her father reminded her that public narratives often demanded a winner and a loser, even when both people were suffering. She entered only after he promised that the family would not use her silence as approval of every headline, and later faced reporters and refused to discuss private matters. She stated only that Gatcombe's future had been settled according to responsibility, continuity, and trust. Charles heard the statement and felt unexpected relief when Harry chose not to attack Louise. The king recognized that the cousins had achieved privately what the older generation had repeatedly failed to do: separate personal pain from public retaliation. He then instructed the estate office to return every item belonging to Harry with a personal letter instead of a formal inventory notice, and acknowledged the refuge she had once given him, but wrote that refuge could not remain where trust was no longer secure. Harry opened the letter alone. His response would determine whether the order became another permanent wound or the boundary that finally ended their long cycle of conflict. The country had already delivered its divided verdict, but the only judgment that truly mattered was contained in the words Harry chose to send back to his aunt. Harry did not respond to and through an interview, a legal challenge, or a carefully prepared public statement. Instead, he wrote to her privately. The letter did not demand the return of Gatcombe Park, nor did it accuse Louise of taking something that belonged to him. Instead, he acknowledged the truth he had resisted throughout the conflict. Access to a family home was never the same as belonging to the family that protected it. Harry sat alone beside the returned box. Childhood photographs rested beside old riding gloves and the handwritten note in which he had once thanked his aunt for giving him refuge. Anne's letter remained open before him, calm and final. He began writing an angry reply, filled the page with accusations, then tore it in half. The second letter was shorter. It accepted the removal without pretending the loss had not hurt him. Harry continued to deny deliberately leaking the equestrian trust plan, the private arrangement created to protect funds, land, and responsibilities connected to Gatcombe. Yet he admitted that he had failed to control the people who treated family relationships as tools in a wider conflict. He had allowed private access to become strategy. That failure, he wrote, belonged to him, even if every damaging action had not been personally approved. And read the reply at Gatcombe and remained silent. She allowed herself to grieve the nephew she had once protected, but she did not confuse sorrow with permission to abandon the boundaries she had established. Her decision had cost him a home. Yet reversing it would have taught the family that trust could be broken without lasting consequences. Louise formally accepted stewardship of the estate arrangement. Stewardship meant the responsibility to protect Gatcombe's future rather than simply possess it. She promised that the property would remain defined by service, privacy, horses, and family continuity instead of rivalry. Her aunt then preserved one room as a private family archive, keeping Harry's childhood memories within the estate even though his right to stay there had ended. Charles later met privately with his son. The king confirmed that he would not overturn Anne's decision, but acknowledged Harry's refusal to attack Louise as an act of restraint worthy of respect. Harry accepted that he would no longer return to Gatcombe as a resident. He asked only that Archie and Lilibet might one day understand the happier memories connected to the estate. Louise agreed. She made it clear that the children would never be held responsible for the choices of adults. That promise prevented the conflict from passing automatically into another generation. Anne's decision was not a triumphant expulsion, and Louise's inheritance was not a reward for obedience. It was a painful declaration that blood alone could not hold a royal family together. Responsibility mattered. Boundaries mattered. Trust mattered most. Harry lost a physical refuge. Louise inherited a demanding responsibility, and accepted the sorrow of closing one gate so the monarchy would stop allowing unresolved pain to become an excuse for repeating the same mistakes. Gatcombe Park passed into Louise's future. Harry accepted the consequences of what had been broken, and Anne's final boundary brought the conflict to an end, not with victory, but with truth. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.